Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the In Street Clothes podcast. With you, as always, I'm Brian Suter, and joining me is the injury guru, the master himself, Jeff Stotts. Jeff, you have had a busy past week.
Yeah, we thought it might be some downtime between the end of the regular season and the postseason, and then several big names, including Luka Doncic, had to go and get injured right before the playoffs. So I've been making my rounds with the Dallas media and a couple other podcasts, just talking about what to expect with Luka. And it's been a wild couple days, that's for sure.
Yeah, I got to give a shout out. Is it Basketball Illuminati, the Illuminati Basketball podcast? Definitely go give that a listen. Jeff was on there this past week with some great insight about everything going on in the NBA. The plan for this episode, as promised, we're just going to run through all of the matchups. We're going to start in the Eastern Conference, go through matchup by matchup, and just kind of review the injury things we're following, things from the end of the regular season that could have some playoff implications. And so, yes, we will get to Luka Doncic. All of you Mavs fans with your binoculars and your 8x zoom cameras zooming into training room windows, we will get there. It's in the show notes below if you want to skip ahead. But let's just jump right into it and get started in the Eastern Conference with a matchup a little bit to be determined, of course. We're filming this on Friday afternoon, and so we still have the last of the play-in games later this evening. But the number one seed, Miami Heat, taking on either Cleveland or Atlanta. Jeff, what are some of the biggest storylines injury-wise going into this series that you're following?
Well, the big one for Miami is Bam Adebayo entering the health and safety protocols right before the end of the regular season. So his status is still to be determined. I checked right before we went on. The injury reports have not been submitted by some of those teams that are playing on Saturday yet, so we still don't know if he's completed those protocols yet. He should have the 5 days, enough time to complete those 5-day protocols. But again, if those symptoms linger, he doesn't complete the protocols, he could be unavailable to start the series. So a lot of questions there. And then PJ Tucker, not as famous as Luka's calf, but he suffered a calf strain around the same time. The Heat did come out and say, look, he's going to be out 7 to 10 days. We're going to reevaluate him at that point. So interesting to see where he plays. But this is a Miami team that's kind of had guys in and out of the lineup all year. They've had, a bunch of little things. They've kind of avoided the big injury, but it seems to be little thing after little thing, and finding some consistency amongst their top guys has been a problem.
They're finally getting Victor Oladipo back. He had this very long, drawn-out, unfortunate recovery process with his quad tendon injury, right, where he tore his quad tendon, had surgery, re-injured it, questionable whether or not it was actually repaired the right way to begin with, but he's finally come back. So they're getting guys back at the right time. Of course, Markieff Morris, that injury back when he had that little altercation with Jokic, I remember thinking in the moment, this doesn't look like it's going to be very good. And sure enough, he missed like 4 months. Now, thankfully, he's back. It seems like so far he's doing okay. So they're a team that I think is getting guys back at the right time. Hopefully, Bam comes back. We always assume that these pro athletes are going to recover really well from COVID and have no issues whatsoever. But we've seen players come back and struggle, right? Jason Tatum famously talked about how he had to use an inhaler for a while after he came back from his bout with COVID. And so to be determined. Hopefully Bam comes back doing just fine and doesn't have any prolonged effects with, getting his win back or anything like that. I think on the other side of things with either Cleveland or Atlanta, again, two teams that have kind of had some struggles here and there. I think, first of all, with Cleveland, Jared Allen, his finger fracture, opted to not have surgery. Seems like he's kind of 50-50. He's approaching that 6-week mark in terms of healing, which is generally when we say fractures are healed. And so if they're able to get through the play-in game and make it to the first round, I suspect that Jared Allen should be back on the court. What about for the Hawks? What players are we following for the Atlanta Hawks with this?
Well, we talked about John Collins and his plantar fascia injury as well as his ring finger injury and how that is still in flux. He's, it's not just one injury, it's two. So even if the finger does heal, how's the foot feeling? Can he get out of bed? Can he jump, run, do those things that he needs to be effective? It's one of those situations where unfortunately you don't have the opportunities or the time to do a gradual ramp up. You're talking about trying to get him back out there and play accordingly. And the Hawks have played surprisingly well since he's gone down. So it'll be interesting to see how they find that healthy balance of are we going to play him? How much are we going to play him? And then also not to kind of disrupt the flow that we found while he's been sidelined.
I think the plantar fascia injury is probably the more concerning if the Hawks are able to advance forward. The finger, he's supposedly going to be wearing a customized splint. Remember, he had that boutonniere deformity with some of those tissues being torn in the finger. But I'd be more concerned about the plantar fascia. That's something that generally can be a sort of off and on type of thing. Even when it goes away, it can sort of pop back up depending on the workload. And so I wouldn't be surprised if, he is able to return for the first round series if they get there. If we see a little bit of kind of lingering here or there, the plantar fascia. And remember too, he's been out since I believe March 11th. So even just getting back his general conditioning during a time of the year when your conditioning has to be at its peak is something to definitely watch. I got to give a props here to Trae Young. Whenever we were going back and reviewing injuries, my first thought was how many times has Trae Young sprained his ankle this past season? And it seems like he's had a pretty healthy year. He really hasn't had any big major ankle injuries. It's nice to see he's been wearing braces this whole season, and so it seems like he's made kind of that Steph Curry model, right, of of getting onto some good rehab, getting some ankle braces on. So credit to Trae Young for sticking around and being a lot more healthy and available this season. Moving on to the next matchup, the Celtics, number 2 seed, taking on the Brooklyn Nets. I think the Nets, this is one of the biggest storylines with Ben Simmons. But let's start with Boston, a story that we covered well. Again, the media covered extensively with Robert Williams. Do you think he'll be back for the first round? What are your projections looking like here for Robert Williams with the Celtics?
I think one of the things we need to talk about when it comes to a player returning is, can the team bank some wins without them and buy them some time? So if he can somehow come back later in the series, or if the Celtics can somehow string together some wins early on and maybe they buy him some time so he can definitely come back in the second round, it's going to be interesting. It's a fine balance to kind of walk and find. So the good news that we've seen is, since we did the breakdown of the injury, we've seen a lot of progression from him. He's been ramping up his activity. There's been some optimism that he could return game 4, game 5, if the series extends, a little bit further than that, maybe he would be available. But I think for me, it's going to come down to what does the Boston schedule look like? Because again, if they can take a substantial lead in this series and they do have home court advantage, can they decide, hey, we feel confident where we are in the series, maybe let's shelve you and not push the envelope here a little bit so that we can have you 100% ready to go for round 2.
I think the other side of that too is let's say they get down in the series, right? They're down, 3-0, they're down 2-0, things are looking a little bit pressured, and he's kind of on the fence of being ready to come back. Sometimes, of course, we might see a little bit more urgency. Well, okay, ideally we'd give him another week or two, but all things considered, this is a critical point in the series. Maybe we try and bring him back for at least some restricted minutes. So I think certainly if they get beyond round 1, we can expect to see him in round 2. And you're right. I think when we see him in round 1 depends more on where he is, not just with his recovery, but also what the series is looking like. If they have games to spare, they're up, no big deal. Sit him out, get him as much time as possible. Otherwise, the Celtics have had a pretty healthy year, I think, right? Really nothing else to be too concerned with for the Celtics in the playoffs coming in.
Yeah, they finished in the top 5 for fewest games lost due to injury this season. So, they've had a couple things. Every team has had injuries this year. Collectively, the injuries have been at an all-time high in terms of man games lost. So to have a team finish in the top 5 is very encouraging, very very rewarding, definitely, because it's allowed them to kind of turn the corner, and hopefully that bodes well and kind of acts as a predictor of how they'll be in the postseason.
Definitely. Moving on to Brooklyn, Ben Simmons, a story we've chronicled extensively on this podcast and both of our individual work here. The latest word is almost like it's his choice is kind of how I've interpreted a lot of the reporting. Like, well, he thinks he'll be ready between game 4, 5, and 6. And, to some degree, I understand that, right? Like, your back might be sore, but if you feel like you can play through it and it doesn't bother you, then you get out there and you play through it. So I have no idea what to expect with him. I feel like it truly is whenever he personally feels like he's ready, he's going to go back out there and play. What are your thoughts with it?
Well, you heard Coach Steve Nash say, it all depends on Ben's back. That's the thing you need to talk to. It wasn't necessarily Nash. So the reports, again, very similar to Robert Williams, have been encouraging. We've seen him, Simmons, increase his activity. It appears the epidural has done what it's supposed to do. But again, now we're talking about high leverage situations. What's your minutes going to look like? you don't have quite the rest sometimes you do during the regular season as you're playing those quick turnaround games. So how is he going to respond? Just because he comes back does not mean he's going to be, number one, playing at a high level and back to being himself. Remember, this guy hasn't played basketball all year. And then the second thing is, what are the ramifications of returning to the court? Does that have a flare up the back? Do we start to have some soreness? And does it lead to other issues that could potentially put him out again? So I'm not optimistic. The reports seem to be trending in the more positive way than they were, say, even just 4 or 5 days ago. Yeah. But I kind of predicted that he wouldn't play again this season. And for now, I'm going to stick by my guns.
You don't think he's going to play the whole season? So even if they get to like the finals, you don't think we'll see him?
Well, maybe it's because I just don't think Boston or Brooklyn's going to get there. Okay, and maybe that's just the pessimism for me, right? So like I just, it's completely changed the longer they prolong their season, obviously. But I think having Durant and Kyrie shoulder that heavy load, and the bench is a little thin due to another injury, and that's Seth Curry's ankle. He just hasn't looked like himself since he suffered that injury. He's missed time for soreness linked to that injury, in and out of the lineup. And he didn't, like, you look at the last playing game, he did not look like himself. And so he's key. He's a huge weapon for them offensively and a key part of what they want to do. And if he's limited and he's out, I just don't know how long they can go on an extended run. Is it possible? 100%. I'm not going to bet against Kevin Durant, but the odds are not in their favor. That's for sure.
I agree with the point about Seth Curry. I think he's one of their most impactful players. And I think the reason he's struggled so much down the stretch is because of the position that the Nets were in, right? They were struggling to make sure they got into the playoff game or to the play-in games. And so you kind of saw that, well, he gets injured, try to heal, recover as long as you can, but then you need him back on the court. And so maybe you come back before things are fully back at 100%. And then you just get stuck in this kind of up and down, perpetual soreness, a little bit of swelling, a little bit of irritation. Nothing that structurally is clearly like, this is harmful, we have to sit you out, but this constant just back and forth battle. And I expect if they advance far into the playoffs, we're going to continue to see that as the minutes get up, as the demand gets up. We're probably going to continue to just see a little bit of this kind of dragging the ankle through the playoffs until they're able to get to a time point where he can seriously shut it down. The Simmons stuff, I want to really highlight too. I think, everybody, of course, has made a lot about the mental side of things. And I think that's a big part of this. Think what you want about what's going on there. But if you haven't played professional basketball in so many months, there's going to be a huge mental challenge regardless of if you've had pre-existing struggles with mental health, of knowing, boy, I'm confident in my body. I feel ready to get back out there. And so I suspect a lot of this, like, well, it kind of depends on Ben's back, is also favoring in with just how he mentally feels ready to get back out there. You don't want to put a guy back out there on the court who mentally doesn't feel like he's ready, whose body can take it. And so as much as we want to have that conversation about the mental health side of things, I think it's really important now as he's kind of in that final stage of getting back. His muscles are probably just fine. His body is moving just fine. But is that kind of mental connection there to where he feels like he can get out there and do what he needs to do within how his back feels and not set himself up to get hurt even more? I'm more optimistic, I think, than you. I think we'll see him back in some short bursts because I think a lot of this is just his mental readiness. I mean, I think at this point, the back should be feeling pretty good. And he just needs to kind of get those reps, get that confidence under his belt to feel like he's ready to get back out there on the court. I don't expect we're going to see big minutes from him. I don't think he's going to be overly impactful, but I could definitely envision him coming in off the bench 10, 15 minutes a game if the series gets extended or if the Nets advance further into the series, which I hope he does. I hope he's able to kind of get through this big, huge hurdle in front of him. And I suspect once he does get through this hurdle, he'll take off running and recover and do really, really well. Anything else in that series that we need to touch on?
I just want to point out that just because I don't think a guy's coming back doesn't mean I don't want him to come back, right? Like I would love to see Simmons come back, right? I'm a basketball fan. I want to see what he looks like with those two guys and the dividends of that Harden trade. So, I'm optimistic that he does come back at some point and we see what those guys look like. But it'll be interesting to see when that does finally occur.
Yeah. Let's move on to the next matchup in the East, the Bucks taking on the Bulls. Chicago fans, beginning of the season, were all ramped up. Team was looking great. Dealt with a lot of big injuries earlier in the season. And thankfully, they're kind of at that point where people are starting to come back, right? We've seen Alex Caruso come back from his injury. Of course, Lonzo Ball, unable to come back from what he dealt with his meniscus tear. What storylines are you keeping an eye on in this series as the playoffs get started?
Well, starting with Chicago, we've talked every episode, it seems like, about meniscus injuries, and this is an example of how they can be difficult to manage in the return to play. Every time they've tried to ramp Lonzo back up, he's had some kind of setback, whether that's some infusion in the area, some soreness. Regardless of what the symptom is, there's something that's keeps cropping up that is preventing him from returning to play. So that's really been the story of their season, right? When they had their backcourt healthy and all these guys clicking on all cylinders, the Bulls were back, right? And then as soon as some of those guys started getting injured, you had those lengthy recoveries. That's where they started to take a step back. That's why they're no longer in the top tier and now, don't have even home court advantage. So it's frustrating. But again, you have Patrick Williams back. They've overcome a couple other injuries. So on the Bulls side, I really think they're as healthy as they can be at this point of the year, which is a good sign. Milwaukee, yeah, go for it.
I feel like they've had great health. I mean, even going back to their run last season, the best ability is availability, and the fact that Giannis has been able to be out there, I feel like they've really gotten fortunate with things in terms of having good success of staying healthy and on the court.
Yeah, it really, the one big hiccup has been Brook Lopez and his back, right? And that was early on in the season. Lengthy recovery, but he's back. He's back in time to play. And they did have an ACL tear. DeAndre Bembry tore his ACL. Unfortunately, they end up waiving him to open up a roster space. But they are as healthy as can be as well going into this postseason. I think we see a deep run from Milwaukee. I really do. They're my favorite going into this. I think we're gonna, spoiler. I think we're gonna see a rematch of last year's finals. But Milwaukee's healthy at the right time, and hopefully they can continue to avoid injury and be comparable to last season.
I agree 100%. I think my pick would be the Bucks and the Suns. Between the two, I don't know. I feel like Giannis is just going to turn it on whenever he wants to and get there, and we're just going to have a repeat of what we saw last season. But yeah, thankfully they're in a good spot going into the finals here, into the playoffs here. Last series coming out of the East, the Sixers taking on the Raptors. Honestly, I think one of the biggest health storylines is not even injury related in this series. It's because of what's going on, of course, with Canada, right? Talk a little bit about some of the concerns there.
So there are limitations based on who can play due to their vaccination rules and regulations. So Matisse Thybulle will not be able to play when the team plays in Toronto. So we didn't know who on Philly was not vaccinated until we started to realize, hey, they might be playing in Toronto. And they actually played a late season game. Guys were ruled ineligible. And so then it started to come out who was and who wasn't vaccinated. It wasn't a problem earlier in the season because visiting teams could still play in New York. And then I believe when they played Toronto, the mandates were not in effect yet. So it had never come up yet. So
yeah, I was wondering how they didn't know until this point. But yeah, that makes sense if the mandates just weren't there yet.
Yeah, so bottom line is Thybulle managed to dance around this all year until the playoffs. And they asked him about it. Why is he not vaccinated? He said it was linked to his holistic lifestyle growing up, and that was his decision. And he's just not going to be available. It's not necessarily an injury storyline, which is different for Philly, right? Because historically, they really felt the ramifications of the process on the injury front. They lost a ton of injuries early on in the process. Joel Embiid missing time with his navicular fracture. Ben Simmons missed time with his fifth metatarsal. They drafted Nerlens Noel, even though he had a torn ACL. All these things accounted for high injury totals in the process, but it also helped drive the process, right? Because that resulted in them losing more games and getting higher picks. Now, they were the third fewest. They had the third fewest games lost this season in the NBA, which is a really good testament to that staff and that medical team. So unfortunately, now we're worried about something that's not necessarily their fault either. So again, it's kind of rearing its head again, unfortunately.
How do you think about Harden going into the playoffs? I know historically down the stretch, he's always kind of gotten this knock about, how he looks come playoff time. He kind of dealt with some nagging stuff last year. Even if this is just more your opinion as like a sports fan, what do you think about Harden going into the playoffs this year?
It's time to put up or shut up for the stance of like everybody wants to see what he's going to do. He had the interview where he said he didn't feel any pressure going into the playoffs. That might be true.
He ought to feel a lot of pressure.
He might not feel it, but he's going to be under a microscope for so many different reasons. The trade, the trade out of Brooklyn. the trade that got him to Brooklyn, the hamstring issues, the weight issues, all these things have kind of created this maelstrom of concern about him and his history of showing up in the playoffs. And it's not fair from a standpoint of that's a lot. And James Harden always seemed to have this really high usage. And so it's not surprising that maybe he started to show some fatigue and breakdown in the postseason. But you are still this guy that has this extreme value, league MVP. The Philadelphia made a huge investment in bringing you here. There's a contract extension on the line. So it's all of these things kind of factoring in at once that I do think results in pressure, even though James may not say he feels it.
I think he should feel pressure. You're right. He might not say he feels it, but I mean, it's definitely hard to look at a guy who's down the stretch in the last handful of seasons. You've been in the playoff, you struggled, you've dealt with injury, and hard to know. Of course, everybody I think falls victim to the look at a picture, and last year we had the whole is Harden wearing a fat suit saga of news. He doesn't look like he's in as good a shape as he was early in his career, but that shouldn't necessarily be a knock to a guy, right? I mean, he's getting older, his playing style might change, his body is changing. What's more important to me is in how you adapt your game and how you make adjustments based on how your body might be naturally changing as you progress in age, as you progress in your career. And so that's more of what I want to see. I want to see how he's able to, if he's saying, okay, this is just how I am, how he's able to adapt. But I think this is going to be a very telling series. It'll be fascinating to see if the 76ers lose early on in the playoffs, what ends up happening with him. But that's certainly more the fan in me than the, the medical provider in me. So both of our picks, I think we both have the Bucks coming out of the Eastern Conference, right?
Yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to the Western Conference. I promise Dallas fans, if you're still listening and you haven't skipped ahead, we're getting there. We're getting to Luka watch. But let's start off with the number 1 seed, the Phoenix Suns, taking on either the Pelicans or the Clippers. Again, recording this on Friday, final play-in game this evening, so yet to be determined if we're looking at the Clippers or the Pelicans in this series. Let's start off with the Phoenix Suns. How are things looking with the Suns going into the playoffs here?
Well, I talked about that elevated injury total this season, and one of the reasons those numbers are so high is we had roughly 9 guys. I think it was 9, maybe 10 if you include John Wall. It kind of decides where do you put John Wall on this scale, because he wasn't injured, but he was a healthy scratch. So I'm not counting him. One of those guys that missed the entire season, of all those guys that missed the entire regular season, did not play a game, missed 82 games, was Dario Saric, who suffered that ACL tear in last year's finals. So that's been the big injury that has resulted in some elevated total for Phoenix. They've also had a couple injuries here and there. The big one was Chris Paul's avulsion fracture in his thumb. But hopefully that means Chris Paul's a little bit healthier than normal, as he did get some time off. Maybe he avoids some soft tissue injuries that have been a problem historically for him in the postseason, and it actually ended up being a little bit of a blessing in disguise.
I think that's a great point. There shouldn't be anything long-term that we worry about with an avulsion fracture of the thumb like he had. This isn't like a meniscus tear, a tendon problem. He shouldn't have any long-term repercussions that affect his basketball play at this point with recovering from that fracture. And the nice thing is when you're recovering from that, you remove, like you said, some of the load from the rest of your soft tissues, but you're still able to maintain some of that basketball shape, right? You're able to still get on the bike. You're able to do cardio. You're able to stay in that good window of being in good basketball shape without overloading your body. And at his age, that's extremely important, right? One of the biggest arguments for why the Lakers won the championship in the bubble was because LeBron James had this huge period of rest before going into the bubble. And there's no doubt that that time off benefited him to ultimately come back and play at a higher level during that burst in the playoffs. That's a great point with Paul. I think we're definitely going to be looking at something like that. Moving on to the New Orleans Pelicans, I think we just continue to be teased about Zion and whether or not he's going to be back, right? He's out here throwing up 360 dunks in warm-ups, but yet they claim he's not ready to go out and play. I heard it first on the telecast this past week. Cassidy Hubbard, I think, reporting that Zion, it was described as a non-linear recovery process. And people were messaging me like, what's non-linear recovery? Like, is that a new thing? And I'm like, no, it's just a polite way of saying he had setbacks, but I think we caught it. Are we just being teased here? Is there any hope that we're maybe going to see Zion back if the Pelicans do make it far into the playoffs? What do you think?
I just don't see it. I just, it's a little bit similar to the Simmons situation, right? Comparable injuries in terms of, how do we respond to load? And yes, it's encouraging to see Zion doing those things, But at what point do you mess with team chemistry, and at what point do you simply risk versus reward? You look at it and make that evaluation. It makes sense to bring him back, or it doesn't. We're not going to be able to gradually ramp him up. It does 2 or 3 minutes here really help us as a team? Because again, what you see in the postseason is coaches shorten their rotation, right? They're using fewer guys. So the high minutes guys are actually getting stretched out. And I just don't know if Zion, not having done anything in a year, is going to be that guy that's going to be able to go out there and just spell somebody, So again, I don't think we see him again, because I don't think or if New Orleans were to win, that they would really outlast the Suns. And so, again, I think their time in the postseason is going to be short, which is going to, again, cut off any chance of him coming back, even if all things look fantastic for him.
I agree 100%. I think, unlike the Simmons story, it almost sounds like Simmons doesn't feel like his back is ready. I almost get the feeling that Zion feels like he's maybe ready, or at least more ready to go out there and play than the team might suggest. But you're right. They're at this spot. A guy's been out for an entire year. Do you bring him back just to get trounced in round 1 by the Suns and then potentially risk something else happening to set him back even further? I'd be shocked if we see him back out there. It's nice to see him with the team. It's nice to see that he is still able to get up and do some of those moves on the court with warm-ups. But you're right, getting back there is a whole other question entirely. Looking at the Clippers, of course, we still have not seen Kawhi Leonard come back. Paul George, I watching that entire Timberwolves game, he is unbelievable. I think Paul George is extremely underrated. Seems like he hasn't missed a beat since coming back from that elbow injury. Anything that we're thinking kind of long-term other than the Kawhi story with the Clippers heading into the playoffs?
Well, of all the teams that qualified for the postseason, we'll just include the play-in teams there as well. The Clippers missed the most games to injury this year, and that was because of Kawhi, which we knew he was going to be elevated. But the other one that elevated their totals was Jason Preston, who's on their roster, who had surgery on his foot right before the start of the season. So he missed the entire season too. So of those 9 guys that I talked about that didn't play this year, 2 of them were on the Clippers. So that instantly elevated their totals. I'm extremely impressed with Paul George, and it's not just the elbow injury; it's the leg injury. That horrific leg injury that we saw.
Right.
And he just has continued. Every time he has a setback, he continues to come back. And he seems to be getting better in terms of just expectations and raising his ceiling even more. It's hard to do that when you're already an all-star. You're already a guy that's been, in the conversation for Team USA, and you've played all these massive roles. And for him to just continue to play at a high level and continue to seem like to get better, like he's refined his game. It's maybe a little bit like what we talked about, what Harden hasn't done, right? Like adapt his game to where he is physically and with his age and his workload. So, if they make the playoffs and play the Suns, I would be so excited. I can't even think of the words. If I could get Kawhi Leonard coming back against the Suns, just because I think the intrigue there would be so amazing.
Yeah, it'd be unbelievable.
I don't think we're going to get it, just because it's just like we've talked about with all the other injury situations. But it's hard to tell with Kawhi, right? He's always been historically cryptic with injury information and his status. So who knows? But maybe the Clippers make it and we see some kind of surprise, but it'll come down to tonight, and I'll be interested to see who comes out on top.
I think, tonight's going to be a good game. I haven't really thought hard enough yet about who I'd take in tonight's game. You're right about Kawhi. If this were any other player that we typically see more in the media, we hear more about their recovery, their rehab, I'd probably have a better sense of what to expect. But with him, he's so secretive. I mean, his whole camp, they're so secretive. And so it would not shock me at all if they win tonight against the Pelicans, and then all of a sudden we hear, Shams Charania reporting that the Clippers expect Kawhi Leonard to make a possible return in the mid, games of the first round. It would not surprise me at all. I mean, the timeline would fit with what we see from a typical ACL tear recovery. But you're right, we just haven't seen any other typical ramp up stuff, and we haven't heard those stories. So it makes us think he's not going to be back out there, but it would not surprise me at all. And talk about a player returning that would totally swing the playoffs potentially. I don't know. Who do you have in tonight's game? Who do you think is going to come out? I think the Clippers.
Yeah, I think it's the Clippers. I want to say the Pelicans in my heart. I love Herb Jones, and that team has been so fun to watch the last 6 weeks. But I think the Clippers do it. I think they've got the edge there, and I'm looking forward to seeing what New Orleans can do next year.
Moving on to the next matchup. At the end of this episode, we're going to celebrate like we just topped the #1 podcast in all of sports on Apple Podcast in celebration here. The Grizzlies and the Timberwolves. I hated all that smack talk about the Timberwolves celebrating. Like, I live in Minnesota. It was snowing the night of that game. Like, it's snowing in April, for goodness sakes. Like, let us have this moment. Let us celebrate what certainly was one of the biggest wins in recent franchise history. And this is going to be an awesome series. I think this is one of the series I'm most excited for, the Grizzlies and the Timberwolves. Let's start off with Memphis. Seem pretty healthy going into things. A little bit of question with John Morant. What are we looking at here with Memphis starting off the first round of the playoffs?
Well, it's been a variety of things for Morant. He missed 11 of the team's final 13 regular season games. It's been some knee soreness, some hip soreness, some back soreness, all these kind of little things, not necessarily any prolonged significant injury that's keeping him out. They did shut him down for that. I think it was an 8-game stretch with the knee, but I think they locked into that 2 seed and said, look, we want everyone healthy and ready for the postseason. We can't go up, we can't go down. We're locked into 2. Let's get everybody healthy. They did it with most of their other players too. You saw guys getting games off here and there. Desmond Bane, Dylan Brooks, all those key contributors missing 1 or 2 games just to buy them some recovery time. So they're as healthy as can be entering this postseason, and it's going to be interesting. They're a fun, exciting team to watch. I'm hoping to get over to a playoff game because that's the closest franchise to me, and it's a quick 2-hour drive from Little Rock. So hoping to get over to see one of those games and see John in person, because if you haven't, he is spectacular. It's amazing to watch.
I need to. I've only been to one NBA game my whole life, and I was like sitting up where I needed a telescope to see anything. But that's one of my sports long-term dreams, is to like sit courtside for an NBA game, sit behind home plate for a baseball game, like experience it in a whole different way. And I imagine, seeing Ja up close in person would be amazing. The other team, of course, they're facing off with, the Timberwolves, have had a pretty fantastic year in terms of health. I think the big thing to follow is Anthony Edwards. He has been dealing with this knee off and on, described as some tendinopathy. You know, he was able to come back. He had a great game in the first round of the play-in, but typically these tendinopathies are things that kind of linger. And so it'll be interesting to watch and see the further they get, if they are able to advance past the Grizzlies, which I don't suspect they will. I think Memphis takes the series. But those tendinopathies can kind of linger, right? It's something that usually takes more shutdown, more specific treatment. You can play through it, but it's more of a pain management question. And so I think Edwards is the biggest question mark in my mind for the Timberwolves. Any other players that you're kind of keeping a close eye on for the Wolves going into the series?
Not really. I mean, they were the healthiest team all year. Shout out to Greg Farnham and their medical staff. They lost the fewest number of games to injury this year. You know, they've been trending upward in terms of health, but they've had kind of 1 or 2 unlucky injuries, specifically Karl Anthony Towns with his hand and wrist injuries that he's had. So for them to be in this position that their health is a big proponent of that. So, you know, I'm excited to see what they can bring. They're a young team, dynamic team. It'll be interesting to see when you have these 2 relatively inexperienced postseason teams going at, you know, who's going to blink first kind of thing. So, you know, you do have some veterans on each side, particularly Pat Beverly with the Timberwolves, that have been there, that have experience, that hopefully can kind of, you know, help guide the younger stars. But, you know, it's going to be, like you said, an awesome series, I think. I would not be shocked if it goes 7. And, you know, again, you got to give the slight edge to Memphis for the fact that Game 7 will be at home.
I'm anxious to see how Anthony Edwards responds in the first game of that series, just because he had such load on his body during that play-in game. Thankfully, they've had a good stretch of time off, but, you know, generally with these tendinopathies, I don't really think of them as injuries more than just like chronic conditions, so to speak. You know, it's not like one thing happened and he injured his knee and now he has tendinopathy. It's this accumulation of load over the course of time that the tendon is not able to adequately respond to and recover from. And you just kind of get stuck in this perpetual state of not being able to kind of restart that healing process. And so it's, you know, he missed a good chunk of time, and maybe it's at a really good spot where we can say he's quote unquote recovered from it. But generally speaking, it's something that the more load you have, the more he's jumping, the more minutes he plays, you know, and closer stretches of time, the more it could bother him. And so I think that'll be the key to watch is if he has a really high load, high usage rate, how he looks the next game in terms of how that knee might be feeling. But otherwise, I think the Wolves are in great shape. Hopefully it's a fantastic series. I'm going to go with the Grizzlies in 7, but I would be thrilled if my local Timberwolves were able to pull it out. Moving on to the Warriors taking on the Nuggets. We've had some good positive updates regarding Steph Curry and his foot injury. We've seen some great clips of him in the gym. He's gone through some practices. Seems like everything's pointing towards him being back in Game 1. What are your thoughts with this series here?
Well, we got some updates in a positive way in more ways than one. So the first one, the most important, is it does look like he's going to play. He's being very active in practice. He's doing post-practice work. He's moving well. He's getting up and down the court, jumping, those kinds of things. The other thing is more positive for you and me, and that in their latest update, they revealed that not only was it a foot sprain, but there was a bone contusion as well. So that makes a little bit more sense on this prolonged timeline they've had with him. It provides a little bit of clarity for us. Bone contusions, which are bone-related injuries, are kind of like light fractures, and there's really no way else to put it, because the body treats them in a similar fashion. It's got to lay down new bone tissue to heal the little cracks that have resulted from that impact injury. So that makes a little bit more sense why this foot sprain kept him out longer than we initially thought, because there was a secondary bone injury. All that being said, trending in the right direction, seems to be ready to play, and he's really the only glaring injury other than the James Wiseman injury, but we knew kind of entering the postseason that he was not going to play. They ruled him out after his second kind of attempt went poorly, so we don't have to be on Wiseman watch as we progress in the postseason.
I thought it was interesting when Curry mentioned that the foot still feels a little bit sore. He mentioned, there's a little bit of pain there, but when the medical staff clears me and says I'm good to go, I got to kind of lock all that out and just commit and get out there and play. And it wouldn't be atypical. I mean, bone bruises can take Kendrick Nunn, right? Worst bone bruise in the history of bone bruises. Bone bruises can take time to recover, right? There can be some persistent soreness. I always kind of thought when we first saw that injury and the mechanism that there had to have been some component to bruising or contusion just from how Smart kind of landed and just basically smashed his foot. And all these little ligaments are so darn close together in the foot that if you have any sort of bruising, contusion, everything in that area is going to light up on MRI, and it can be really hard to tease out which little tiny specific, ligament might be sprained. And so I wonder if this bone bruise was kind of a big part of it to begin with. It's just, it doesn't sound as encouraging when you say, well, he's going to miss a month with a bone bruise. People are maybe a little bit more critical. But I would suspect that ligament is doing great. There might be some residual soreness from that bruise, and don't be surprised if things kind of linger here in the first round or so as he gets out there and plays. Well, the foot's a little bit sore. The key is going to be, does the pain escalate? Is the foot still sore 2 days after the game? Is it really sore the next day where he's limping around? If he's able to keep his pain level at, let's say, a 2 or a 3 out of 10, and it never gets above like a 5, that's something that we're generally okay with. It's the trajectory of the pain, making sure the pain is not getting worse, and hopefully it's either staying stable or it's improving and going in the right direction. Moving on to the other team in that series, the Denver Nuggets. The Nuggets have kind of been like a bit of an afterthought for me this season. They've kind of hung out in the middle of the pack. The big thing I've been watching for all year is what to expect with Michael Porter Jr. and Jamal Murray. This past week, we got some more news about Jamal Murray, kind of similar situation to Kawhi Leonard. Another guy that I would not be shocked at all if he shows up and is able to play some minutes in the postseason, but I also wouldn't be surprised if we don't hear from him at all. What are you thinking with the thought of the Nuggets here going into the series with the Warriors?
I will be surprised if either one of these guys comes back. I do think this team is who they are at this point. I think they understand the risk of short-term versus long-term. They know their window is not closed, and that if they can get Murray and Porter Jr. back next year with Jokic, they've still got a chance to be a legitimate contender. And so let's not run the risk of being as patient, offsetting everything we've done to this point by just trying to rush them back. Now, again, if they feel like the next phase is recovery is playing in high leverage situations, maybe they play some minutes. It's just hard to imagine them doing that at this point. Especially Porter Jr. I'm more worried about Porter Jr. than I would be Murray, just because the back has been operated on multiple times. It was a red flag going into the draft, and there have been some other issues with him that have crept up over the years as well. So it's not quite as black and white as is the back healthy. All right, go. Murray, on the other hand, like you said, the timeline kind of adds up, but we knew this was going to have a carryover effect when it occurred. And for now, I think we focus on next year.
I think fans have to realize, again, if you suffer, this is a common problem we run into with baseball players when they have UCL, like elbow injuries, is that the time point at which you have to be considering, well, if we do surgery, how much time are you missing? And so in these scenarios, if somebody like MPJ or Murray come back, and let's say, hopefully not, but God forbid something else bad happened, now you're losing all of next season again, just because of where we're at in the calendar. And so for the Nuggets, I think sometimes these teams just have to be realistic and say, well, boy, we're not expecting to win the finals this year. This isn't like this is the Miami Heat and they're trying to make that strong push. To say, well, it's just not worth that risk. It's not worth the risk of someone coming back for 2 games or a couple of weeks and then suffering some other fluke thing, other side gets injured to where now they miss all of next season again. And so eventually you got to come back at some point, right? But certainly not in an instance where there's pretty low reward compared to the risk that you'll see. So I agree. I don't think we see either of them. And I'd be fine with that. I don't think Nuggets fans should be upset. I think that should sort of be the expectation. Anything else here is gravy. All right, Mavs fans, you stuck with us.
Here we go.
We intentionally, I swear, we didn't intentionally leave this to the very end just to lure you guys through. This is just the way the matchups fell when we kind of put the spreadsheet together. But the Mavs taking on the Utah Jazz. The biggest storyline of the series, Joe Ingles missing. No, I'm kidding. All right, Luka's calf. Let's play detective, analyzing every little bit of footage we've seen. I loved Luka waving, from the training room the other day. I think he totally gets that everybody is crazy scrutinizing this. Where do things stand? You've made a ton of great reporting and kind of media rounds on this throughout the week. Where do things stand Friday afternoon before round 1, game 1 with Luka's calf?
So we know it's a calf strain. We do not know the grade. Based on the fact that they have not already ruled him out, my guess is it's somewhere between a 1 and a 2, kind of in that gray area between the two. I think if it had been a more moderate to a partial tear, they would have already ruled him out and said he's not going to play. The fact that they haven't shut the door on him is promising and encouraging for Mavs fans. And then really everything we've seen for this far is standard procedure for this kind of injury. We saw him go get an MRI. We saw him enter the hospital wearing the boot, wearing the compression sleeve. The compression sleeve was for inflammation. The boot was to take off load of that muscle. Completely standard approach, even if it was a grade 1 strain. We've since seen him hop on an exercise bike and ride the bike. That's a really good exercise because it's non-weight bearing. It promotes blood flow to the area. It allows him to maintain his cardio. And we just haven't seen him on a basketball court. And I think this is going to be a true game time decision for each game of this series. I think the fact that Dallas plays this first game of the postseason makes it unlikely he plays in game 1. I think you look at it and say the chances are pretty low of him coming back. Game 2, that makes a little bit more sense to me. I would have been more comfortable if that had been on a Tuesday, but the fact that they do play Monday puts that more in play. And if I'm Dallas, I'm trying to enter with a split here at home, potentially get to a game 5 where it's 2-2. We've still got home court. Luka's back healthy. And let's see if we make this a best out of 3 series rather than, trying to force it and then lose him for the first series. And then you don't have him at all moving forward in the postseason, not just this round 1.
Yeah, this is a situation where they do have to think a little bit long-term about how they are hoping to make a run in the playoffs. This isn't like first round and we're out. This is a team that, definitely feels like they can make a good run. And so if you put him back out there game 1 and suddenly he makes the injury worse or he hurts his hamstring or something else, now suddenly maybe he is out for the playoffs. And so I agree with you. It would have been nice to see game 2 on Tuesday. I'd say I'm 50-50 with if we'll see him back on game 2. I think, again, it depends on how they're doing. If the Mavs win game 1 and it looked great, they blow him out, everything looks really positive, I could see him holding him out for game 2. And then if they win game 2 without him, I could see them holding him out for game 3. I think they're going to give him game by game as much time as possible, depending on how they're doing in the series. I think it's going to be important for Luka to be honest with the medical staff because he might get out there, the calf might feel a little bit sore. He might try to disregard that, go out there, push off and make things worse. And so it's really important in these situations when you're kind of at that fine line of returning an athlete back that the athlete is very aware of needing to have that open communication and understand what the signs are that, hey, this isn't quite right. I need to sit out because I'm not ready yet, and doesn't try to go through and push through things. I hope that Mavs fans can just like take a deep breath. I even, as much as I like following this stuff, even I'm overwhelmed by all of these like zoomed in grainy shots of like, I think the worst one I saw was it was like the back of Luka's head and he was presumably in a squat rack. Like we got to take a chill pill a little bit with some of this stuff and stop trying to analyze the shoe he's wearing and the sock that's on his leg and this and that, and just understand that, like you said, everything that we've seen is status quo. Everything we've seen is what we would expect to see. He's got a real injury. It's a real injury that typically takes at least a couple of weeks. And so we're trying to see things progress as quickly as possible, but scrutinizing over every little like, how fast was he pedaling on the bike? Like how quick was he jogging on the court? Is not going to help anybody. It's just going to stress everybody out. We'll see him when we see him. And hopefully that's sooner rather than later. Any hope that Tim Hardaway Jr. comes back here after that surgery for his fifth metatarsal fracture?
I had been optimistic that Tim Hardaway Jr. would have a chance at playing when the postseason started, but I still think he's a few weeks away. We have seen him on the court doing some things, so that's encouraging, but he's not quite ready to go. I think this would have been the perfect situation for him to try getting back because they could potentially be a man down. And can he give them something in terms of just filling some of that void if Luka is unable to play? But the fact that we haven't really heard much on him suggests that he's just not quite ready. And it's a difficult injury to manage, and it's not surprising to see that he's not quite ready to play.
I think, again, it's kind of bonus if we see him back a little bit here. I think the further they go, if they certainly make it deep in the playoffs, we could see him return. I think the bigger key is just, we've seen other guys. Zion, of course, had the same injury, same type of surgery, had poor healing. And so I'd focus more for Mavs fans on just making sure he's healing well, thinking about how this is going to be going into next season rather than trying to rush him back on the court for the playoffs this year when they've been playing really, really well without him, thankfully. Any big stories with Utah? Of course, Ingles out for the year with his ACL tear and then, of course, got traded. Otherwise, it seems like there's not too many big stories we're following with the Jazz heading into the series.
Yeah, what's funny is their big injuries were calf injuries. Rudy Gobert missed an extended period of time with a calf injury, but he's back and healthy. A couple other fringe rotation guys out for the year, but not anybody that's necessarily going to be impactful in the series.
So your pick coming out of the Western Conference sounds like the Suns, right?
Yep.
I'm with you. I think the Suns are going to come out as well. I got to mention, too, I was checking Twitter just as we were recording this, some breaking news. Paul George is in health and safety protocols and is expected to miss, of course, tonight's game. So I think that changes my pick. I think it wouldn't surprise me now. It wouldn't surprise me now if the Pelicans are able to pull this out, which is unfortunate just because of all the potential for, people like Kawhi to come back for the Clippers. And obviously if the Clippers do make it right, this could have big implications on the first round matchup with the Suns, because presumably this isn't going to be like a 1 or 2 day absence, right? I mean, what's the shortest that he could even miss if they do win tonight's game?
I'm pretty sure it's 5 days, as far as the protocol is concerned at this point. So we mentioned a little bit when we talked about Bam, but the Clippers curse strikes again. I'm not big on curses, but man, this is just the latest setback for a franchise that seems to have setback after setback, especially when it comes to health.
Yeah. Well, enjoy the first round of the playoffs, everybody. I will certainly update in next week's episode if we see any big news coming out of the playoffs and just kind of how these guys are looking with some of their returns. We'll, of course, address other sports as they come up next week, but wanted to focus just on the NBA this week for you all. Anything else you want to touch on here, Jeff, before we end things?
Dallas, please don't be mad at me if Luka doesn't come back. It's not my fault. I tried to paint an optimistic picture here, but it is a tricky injury. Just my final word there is trust Casey Smith and his staff. They're a high regarded upper echelon staff, and I know that they will do their best to gauge his short-term and long-term health and make the best decision for the franchise.
And also, I don't want to hear any more of these Kevin Durant Achilles ruptures comparisons, right? I mean, we do not counsel people on the risk of rupturing their Achilles whenever they return from a calf strain. Like these are two different injuries. God forbid, knock on wood, something fluky happens, but I've seen so many people say, well, we don't want another Kevin Durant situation. Get that out of your mind. Like these are different locations. I don't see any reason why Dallas fans should be worried if we see him out there game one that, oh my gosh, Luka is going to rupture his Achilles. So great points with those. They've got the best staffs they can have access to. These are players with top-notch medical care. But at the end of the day, it's still biology, just like you and I have our underlying biology with how our bodies heal and recover. And we'll be here to kind of guide things along for you all with what we see and what the updates are. But definitely do not hold us accountable. That's why I stay out of the fantasy sports realm, because I don't want people making gambling decisions off of these types of things. All right, everybody. Well, thanks again. Another great episode here. Be sure and leave us a good review, some comment if you enjoy listening here, and I'll see you next week, Jeff.
Appreciate it.